Chapter 22 of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 22. The King's Table. Fouquet was present, as D'Artagnan had said, at the king's card table. It seemed as if Buckingham's departure had shed a balm on the lacerated hearts of the previous evening. Monsieur, radiant with delight, made 1,000 affectionate signs to his mother. The Count de Guiche could not separate himself from Buckingham, and while playing conversed with him upon the circumstance of his projected voyage. Buckingham, thoughtful and kind in his manner, like a man who has adopted a resolution, listened to the Count, and from time to time cast a look full of regret and hopeless affection at Madame. The Princess, in the midst of her elation of spirits, divided her attention between the King, who was playing with her, Monsieur, who quietly joked with her about her enormous winnings, and De Guiche, who exhibited an extravagant delight. Of Buckingham she took but little notice. For her this fugitive, this exile, was now simply a remembrance, no longer a man. Light hearts are thus constituted. While they themselves continue untouched, they roughly break off with every one who may possibly interfere with their little calculations of self-comfort. Madame had received Buckingham's smiles and attentions and sighs while he was present. But what was the good of sighing, smiling, and kneeling at a distance? Can one tell in what direction the winds in the Channel, which toss mighty vessels to and fro, carry such signs as these? The Duke could not fail to mark this change, and his heart was cruelly hurt. Of a sensitive character, proud and susceptible of deep attachment, he cursed the day on which such a passion had entered his heart. The looks he cast from time to time at Madame became colder by degrees at the chilling complexion of his thoughts. He could hardly yet despair, but he was strong enough to impose silence upon the tumultuous outcries of his heart. In exact proportion, however, as Madame suspected this change of feeling, she redoubled her activity to regain the ray of light she was about to lose. Her timid and indecisive mind was displayed in brilliant flashes of wit and humour. At any cost, she felt that she must be remarked above everything and everyone, even above the king himself. And she was so, for the queens, notwithstanding their dignity, and the king, despite the respect which etiquette required, were all eclipsed by her. The queens, stately and ceremonious, were softened and could not restrain their laughter. Madame Henriette, the queen mother, was dazzled by the brilliancy which cast distinction upon her family, thanks to the wit of the granddaughter of Henry IV. The king, jealous as a young man and as a monarch of the superiority of those who surrounded him, could not resist admitting himself vanquished by a petulance so thoroughly French in its nature, whose energy more than ever increased by English humour. Like a child, he was captivated by her radiant beauty, which her wit made still more dazzling. Madame's eyes flashed like lightning. Wit and humour escaped from her scarlet lips, like persuasion from the lips of Nestor of old. The whole court, subdued by her enchanting grace, noticed for the first time that laughter could be indulged in before the greatest monarch in the world, like people who merited their appellation of the wittiest and most polished people in Europe. Madame, from that evening, achieved and enjoyed a success capable of bewildering all not born to those altitudes termed thrones, which, in spite of their elevation, are sheltered from such giddiness. From that very moment Louis XIV acknowledged Madame as a person to be recognized. Buckingham regarded her as a coquette, deserving the cruelest tortures, and De Guiche looked upon her as a divinity. The courtiers as a star whose light might some day become the focus of all favour and power. And yet Louis XIV, a few years previously, had not even condescended to offer his hand to that ugly girl for a ballet, and Buckingham had worshipped this coquette on both knees. De Guiche had once looked upon this divinity as a mere woman, and the courtiers had not dared to extol this star in her upward progress, fearful to disgust the monarch whom such a dull star had formerly displeased. Let us see what was taking place during this memorable evening at the king's card table. The young queen, although Spanish by birth, and the niece of Anne of Austria, loved the king, and could not conceal her affection. Anne of Austria, a keen observer, like all women, and imperious, like every queen, was sensible of Madame's power, and acquiesced in it immediately, a circumstance which induced the young queen to raise the siege and retire to her apartments. The king hardly paid any attention to her departure, notwithstanding the pretended symptoms of indisposition by which it was accompanied. Encouraged by the rules of etiquette, which he had begun to introduce at the court as an element of every relation of life, Louis XIV did not disturb himself. He offered his hand to Madame without looking at Monsieur, his brother, and led the young princess to the door of her apartments. It was remarked that at the threshold of the door his Majesty, freed from every restraint, or not equal to the situation, sighed very deeply. The ladies present, nothing escapes a woman's glance, Mademoiselle Montalais, for instance, did not fail to say to each other, "The king sighed," and "Madame sighed too." This had indeed been the case. Madame had sighed very noiselessly, but with an accompaniment very far more dangerous for the king's repose. Madame had sighed, first closing her beautiful black eyes, next opening them, and then, laden as they were with an indescribable mournfulness of expression, she had raised them towards the king, whose face at that moment visibly heightened in colour. The consequence of these blushes, of those interchanged sighs, and of this royal agitation was, that Montalais had committed an indiscretion which had certainly affected her companion, for Mademoiselle de la Valliere, less clear-sighted perhaps, turned pale when the king blushed, and her attendance being required upon Madame, she tremblingly followed the princess without thinking of taking the gloves which court etiquette required her to do. True it is that the young country girl might allege as her excuse the agitation into which the king seemed to be thrown, for Mademoiselle de la Valliere, busily engaged in closing the door, had involuntarily fixed her eyes upon the king, who, as he retired backwards, had his face towards it. The king returned to the room where the card tables were set out. He wished to speak to the different persons there, but it was easy to see that his mind was absent. He jumbled different accounts together, which was taken advantage of by some of the noblemen, who had retained those habits since the time of M. Mazarin, who had a poor memory, but was a good calculator. In this way, M. Manicamp, with a thoughtless and absent air, for M. Manicamp was the honestest man in the world, appropriated 20,000 francs, which were littering the table, and which did not seem to belong to any person in particular. In the same way, M. de Wardes, whose head was doubtless a little bewildered by the occurrences of the evening, somehow forgot to leave behind him the 60 double louis which he had won for the Duke of Buckingham, and which the duke, incapable, like his father, of soiling his hands with coin of any sort, had left lying on the table before him. The king only recovered his attention in some degree at the moment that M. Colbert, who had been narrowly observant for some minutes, approached, and doubtless with great respect, yet with much perseverance, whispered a counsel of some sort into the still tingling ears of the king. The king, at the suggestion, listened with renewed attention, and immediately looking around him, said, "Is Monsieur Fouquet no longer here?" "Yes, sire, I am here," replied the superintendent, till then engaged with Buckingham, and approached the king, who advanced a step towards him with a smiling yet negligent air. "Forgive me," said Louis, "if I interrupt your conversation, but I claim your attention wherever I may require your services." "I am always at the king's service," replied Fouquet. "And your cash box too," said the king, laughing with his false smile. "My cash box more than anything else," said Fouquet, coldly. "The fact is, I wish to give a fete at Fontainebleau, to keep open house for 15 days, and I shall require—" and he stopped, glancing at Colbert. Fouquet waited without showing discomposure, and the king resumed, answering Colbert's icy smile. 4,000,000 francs. 4,000,000, repeated Fouquet, bowing profoundly, and his nails, buried in his bosom, were thrust into his flesh, but the tranquil expression of his face remained unaltered. When will they be required, sire? Take your time. I mean, no, no, as soon as possible. A certain time will be necessary, sire. Time! Exclaimed Colbert triumphantly. The time, monsieur, said the superintendent, with the haughtiest disdain, simply to count the money. 1,000,000 can only be drawn and weighed in a day. 4 days, then, said Colbert. My clerks, replied Fouquet, addressing himself to the king, will perform wonders on his majesty's service, and the sum shall be ready in 3 days. It was for Colbert now to turn pale. Louis looked at him astonished. Fouquet withdrew without any parade or weakness, smiling at his numerous friends, in whose countenances alone he read the sincerity of their friendship, an interest partaking of compassion. Fouquet, however, should not be judged by his smile, for in reality he felt as if he had been stricken by death. Drops of blood beneath his coat stained the fine linen that clothed his chest. His dress concealed the blood, and his smile the rage which devoured him. His domestics perceived, by the manner in which he approached his carriage, that their master was not in the best of humours. The result of their discernment was, that his orders were executed with that exactitude of manoeuvre which is found on board a man of war, commanded during a storm by an ill-tempered captain. The carriage, therefore, did not simply roll along, it flew. Fouquet had hardly time to recover himself during the drive. On his arrival, he went at once to Aramis, who had not yet retired for the night. As for Porthos, he had supped very agreeably off a roast leg of mutton, 2 pheasants, and a perfect heap of crayfish. He then directed his body to be anointed with perfumed oils, in the manner of the wrestlers of old, and when this anointment was complete, he had himself wrapped in flannels and placed in a warm bed. Aramis, as we have already said, had not retired. Seated at his ease in a velvet dressing gown, he wrote letter after letter in that fine and hurried handwriting, a page of which contained 1/4 of a volume. The door was thrown hurriedly open, and the superintendent appeared, pale, agitated, anxious. Aramis looked up. "Good evening," said he, and his searching look detected his host's sadness and disordered state of mind. "Was your play as good as his majesty's?" asked Aramis, by way of beginning the conversation. Fouquet threw himself upon a couch, and then pointed to the door to the servant who had followed him. When the servant had left, he said, "Excellent." Aramis, who had followed every movement with his eyes, noticed that he stretched himself upon the cushions with a sort of feverish impatience. "You have lost as usual?" inquired Aramis, his pen still in his hand. "Even more than usual," replied Fouquet. "You know how to support losses?" "Sometimes." "What, Monsieur Fouquet, a bad player?" "There is play and play, Monsieur d'Herblay." "How much have you lost?" inquired Aramis, with a slight uneasiness. Fouquet collected himself a moment, and then, without the slightest emotion, said, "The evening has cost me 4 millions," and a bitter laugh drowned the last vibration of these words. Aramis, who did not expect such an amount, dropped his pen. 4 millions, he said. "You have lost 4 millions? Impossible." "Monsieur Colbert held my cards for me," replied the superintendent, with a similar bitter laugh. "Ah, now I understand. So, a new application for funds." "Yes, and from the king's own lips. It was impossible to ruin a man with a more charming smile. What do you think of it?" "It is clear that your destruction is the object in view." "That is your opinion?" "Still. Besides, there is nothing in it which should astonish you, for we have foreseen it all along." "Yes, but I did not expect 4 millions." "No doubt the amount is serious, but after all 4 millions are not quite the death of a man, especially when the man in question is Monsieur Fouquet. My dear d'Herblay, if you knew the contents of my coffers, you would be less easy." "And you promised? What could I do?" "That's true. The very day I refuse, Colbert will procure the money, whence I know not, but he will procure it, and I shall be lost. There is no doubt of that. In how many days did you promise the 4 millions? In 3 days. The king seemed exceedingly pressed. In 3 days? When I think, resumed Fouquet, that just now as I passed along the streets, the people cried out, 'There is the rich Monsieur Fouquet,' it is enough to turn my brain." "Stay, monsieur, the matter is not worth so much trouble," said Aramis, calmly, sprinkling some sand over the letter he had just written. "Suggest a remedy, then, for this evil without a remedy." "There is only one remedy for you. Pay." "But it is very uncertain whether I have the money. Everything must be exhausted. Belle Isle is paid for, the pension has been paid, and money, since the investigation of the accounts of those who farm the revenue, is scarce. Besides, admitting that I pay this time, how can I do so on another occasion? When kings have tasted money, they are like tigers who have tasted flesh. They devour everything. The day will arrive, must arrive, when I shall have to say, 'Impossible, sire,' and on that very day I am a lost man." Aramis raised his shoulders slightly, saying, "A man in your position, my lord, is only lost when he wishes to be so. A man, whatever his position may be, cannot hope to struggle against a king." "Nonsense. When I was young, I wrestled successfully with the Cardinal Richelieu, who was king of France, nay more, cardinal. Where are my armies, my troops, my treasures? I have not even Belle Isle." "Bah! Necessity is the mother of invention, and when you think all is lost, something will be discovered which will retrieve everything." "Who will discover this wonderful something?" "Yourself." "I resign my office of inventor." "Then I will." "Be it so, but set to work without delay." "Oh, we have time enough." "You kill me, D'Herblay, with your calmness," said the superintendent, passing his handkerchief over his face. "Do you not remember that I one day told you not to make yourself uneasy if you possessed courage? Have you any?" "I believe so." "Then don't make yourself uneasy. It is decided, then, that, at the last moment, you will come to my assistance?" "It will only be the repayment of a debt I owe you." "It is the vocation of financiers to anticipate the wants of men such as yourself, D'Herblay." "If obligingness is the vocation of financiers, charity is the virtue of the clergy. Only on this occasion do you act, monsieur. You are not yet sufficiently reduced, and at the last moment we will see what is to be done." "We shall see, then, in a very short time." "Very well. However, permit me to tell you that personally I regret exceedingly that you are at present so short of money, because I myself was about to ask you for some." "For yourself?" "For myself, or some of my people, for mine or for ours." "How much do you want?" "Be easy on that score, a roundish sum, it is true, but not too exorbitant." "Tell me the amount." 50,000 francs. "Oh, a mere nothing. Of course one always has 50,000 francs. Why the deuce cannot that knave Colbert be as easily satisfied as you are, and I should give myself far less trouble than I do. When do you need this sum?" "Tomorrow morning." "But you wish to know its destination?" "Nay, nay, chevalier, I need no explanation." "Tomorrow is the 1st of June." "Well?" "One of our bonds becomes due." "I did not know we had any bonds." "Certainly. Tomorrow we pay our last third installment." "What third?" "Of the 150,000 francs to Baisemeaux." "Baisemeaux! Who is he?" "The governor of the Bastile." "Yes, I remember. On what grounds am I to pay 150,000 francs for that man?" "On account of the appointment which he, or rather we, purchased from Louviere and Tremblay." "I have a very vague recollection of the matter." "That is likely enough, for you have so many affairs to attend to. However, I do not believe you have any affair in the world of greater importance than this one. Tell me, then, why we purchased this appointment." Why, in order to render him a service in the first place, and afterwards ourselves. Ourselves? You are joking. Monseigneur, the time may come when the governor of the Bastile may prove a very excellent acquaintance. I have not the good fortune to understand you, D'Herblay. Monseigneur, we had our own poets, our own engineer, our own architect, our own musicians, our own printer, and our own painters. We need our own governor of the Bastile. Do you think so? Let us not deceive ourselves, Monseigneur. We are very much opposed to paying the Bastile a visit, added the prelate, displaying beneath his pale lips teeth which were still the same beautiful teeth so much admired 30 years previously by Marie Michon. And you think it is not too much to pay 150,000 francs for that? I thought you generally put out money at better interest than that. The day will come when you will admit your mistake. My dear D'Herblay, the very day on which a man enters the Bastile, he is no longer protected by his past. Yes, he is, if the bonds are perfectly regular. Besides, that good fellow Baisemeaux has not a courtier's heart. I am certain, my lord, that he will not remain ungrateful for that money, without taking into account, I repeat, that I retain the acknowledgments. It is a very strange affair, usury in a matter of benevolence. Do not mix yourself up with it, Monseigneur. If there be usury, it is I who practise it, and both of us reap the advantage from it. That is all. Some intrigue, D'Herblay. I do not deny it. And Baisemeaux an accomplice in it? Why not? There are worse accomplices than he. May I depend, then, upon the 5,000 pistoles to-morrow? Do you want them this evening? It would be better, for I wish to start early. Poor Baisemeaux will not be able to imagine what has become of me, and must be upon thorns. You shall have the amount in an hour. Ah, D'Herblay, the interest of your 150,000 francs will never pay my 4 millions for me. Why not, Monseigneur? Good night. I have business to transact with my clerks before I retire. A good night's rest, Monseigneur. D'Herblay, you wish things that are impossible. Shall I have my 50,000 francs this evening? Yes. Go to sleep, then, in perfect safety. It is I who tell you to do so. Notwithstanding this assurance, and the tone in which it was given, Fouquet left the room shaking his head, and heaving a sigh. Chapter 22. Of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 years later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 23. Monsieur Baisemeaux de Montlezun's accounts. The clock of St. Paul was striking 7, as Aramis, on horseback, dressed as a simple citizen, that is to say, in coloured suit, with no distinctive mark about him, except a kind of hunting knife by his side, passed before the Rue du Petit Musc, and stopped opposite the Rue des Tournelles, at the gate of the Bastile. 2 sentinels were on duty at the gate. They made no difficulty about admitting Aramis, who entered without dismounting, and they pointed out the way he was to go by a long passage with buildings on both sides. This passage led to the drawbridge, or, in other words, to the real entrance. The drawbridge was down, and the duty of the day was about being entered upon. The sentinel at the outer guard-house stopped Aramis' future progress, asking him, in a rough tone of voice, what had brought him there. Aramis explained, with his usual politeness, that a wish to speak to Monsieur Baisemeaux de Montlezun had occasioned his visit. The first sentinel then summoned a second sentinel, stationed within an inner lodge, who showed his face at the grating, and inspected the new arrival most attentively. Aramis reiterated the expression of his wish to see the governor, whereupon the sentinel called to an officer of lower grade, who was walking about in a tolerably spacious courtyard, and who, in turn, on being informed of his object, ran to seek one of the officers of the governor's staff. The latter, after having listened to Aramis' request, begged him to wait a moment, then went away a short distance, but returned to ask his name. "I cannot tell it you, monsieur," said Aramis. "I need only mention that I have matters of such importance to communicate to the governor, that I can only rely beforehand upon one thing, that Monsieur de Baisemeaux will be delighted to see me. Nay, more than that, when you have told him that it is the person whom he expected on the 1st of June, I am convinced he will hasten here himself." The officer could not possibly believe that a man of the governor's importance should put himself out for a person of so little importance as the citizen-looking visitor on horseback. "It happens most fortunately, monsieur," he said, "that the governor is just going out, and you can perceive his carriage with the horses already harnessed, in the courtyard yonder. There will be no occasion for him to come to meet you, as he will see you as he passes by." Aramis bowed to signify his assent. He did not wish to inspire others with too exalted an opinion of himself, and therefore waited patiently and in silence, leaning upon the saddle-bow of his horse. 10 minutes had hardly elapsed when the governor's carriage was observed to move. The governor appeared at the door, and got into the carriage, which immediately prepared to start. The same ceremony was observed for the governor himself as with a suspected stranger. The sentinel at the lodge advanced as the carriage was about to pass under the arch, and the governor opened the carriage door, himself setting the example of obedience to orders, so that, in this way, the sentinel could convince himself that no one quitted the Bastile improperly. The carriage rolled along under the archway, but at the moment the iron gate was opened, the officer approached the carriage, which had again been stopped, and said something to the governor, who immediately put his head out of the doorway, and perceived Aramis on horseback at the end of the drawbridge. He immediately uttered almost a shout of delight, and got out, or rather darted out of his carriage, running towards Aramis, whose hands he seized, making 1,000 apologies. He almost embraced him. "What a difficult matter to enter the Bastile," said Aramis. "Is it the same for those who are sent here against their wills, as for those who come of their own accord?" "1,000 pardons, my lord. How delighted I am to see your grace!" "Hush! What are you thinking of, my dear Monsieur Baisemeaux? What do you suppose would be thought of a bishop in my present costume?" "Pray excuse me, I had forgotten." "Take this gentleman's horse to the stables," cried Baisemeaux. "No, no," said Aramis, "I have 5,000 pistoles in the saddlebags." The governor's countenance became so radiant, that if the prisoners had seen him, they would have imagined some prince of the royal blood had arrived. "Yes, you are right. The horse shall be taken to the government house. Will you get into the carriage, my dear Monsieur d'Herblay, and it shall take us back to my house?" "Get into a carriage to cross a courtyard? Do you believe I am so great an invalid? No, no, we will go on foot." Baisemeaux then offered his arm as a support, but the prelate did not accept it. They arrived in this manner at the government house, Baisemeaux rubbing his hands and glancing at the horse from time to time, while Aramis was looking at the bleak bare walls. A tolerably handsome vestibule and a staircase of white stone led to the governor's apartments, who crossed the antechamber, the dining room, where breakfast was being prepared, opened a small side door, and closeted himself with his guest in a large cabinet, the windows of which opened obliquely upon the courtyard and the stables. Baisemeaux installed the prelate with that all-inclusive politeness of which a good man, or a grateful man, alone possesses the secret. An armchair, a footstool, a small table beside him on which to rest his hand, everything was prepared by the governor himself. With his own hands, too, he placed upon the table with much solicitude the bag containing the gold, which one of the soldiers had brought up with the most respectful devotion. And the soldier having left the room, Baisemeaux himself closed the door after him, drew aside one of the window curtains, and looked steadfastly at Aramis to see if the prelate required anything further. "Well, my lord," he said, still standing up, "of all men of their word, you still continue to be the most punctual." "In matters of business, dear Monsieur de Baisemeaux, exactitude is not a virtue only, it is a duty as well." "Yes, in matters of business, certainly. But what you have with me is not of that character. It is a service you are rendering me. Come, confess, dear Monsieur Baisemeaux, that notwithstanding this exactitude, you have not been without a little uneasiness." "About your health I certainly have," stammered out Baisemeaux. "I wished to come here yesterday, but I was not able, as I was too fatigued," continued Aramis. Baisemeaux anxiously slipped another cushion behind his guest's back. "But," continued Aramis, "I promised myself to come and pay you a visit to-day, early in the morning." "You are really very kind, my lord." "And it was a good thing for me I was punctual, I think." "What do you mean?" "Yes, you were going out." At which latter remark Baisemeaux coloured and said, "It is true, I was going out." "Then I prevent you," said Aramis, whereupon the embarrassment of Baisemeaux became visibly greater. "I am putting you to inconvenience," he continued, fixing a keen glance upon the poor governor. "If I had known that, I should not have come. How can your lordship imagine that you could ever inconvenience me?" "Confess, you were going in search of money." "No," stammered out Baisemeaux, "no, I assure you I was going to—" "Does the governor still intend to go to Monsieur Fouquet?" suddenly called out the major from below. Baisemeaux ran to the window like a madman. "No, no," he exclaimed in a state of desperation. "Who the deuce is speaking of Monsieur Fouquet? Are you drunk below there? Why am I interrupted when I am engaged on business?" "You were going to Monsieur Fouquet's," said Aramis, biting his lips. "To Monsieur Fouquet, the abbe or the superintendent?" Baisemeaux almost made up his mind to tell an untruth, but he could not summon courage to do so. "To the superintendent," he said. "It is true, then, that you were in want of money, since you were going to a person who gives it away?" "I assure you, my lord—" "You were afraid?" "My dear lord, it was the uncertainty and ignorance in which I was as to where you were to be found. You could have found the money you required at Monsieur Fouquet's, for he is a man whose hand is always open." "I swear that I should never have ventured to ask Monsieur Fouquet for money. I only wished to ask him for your address." "To ask Monsieur Fouquet for my address?" exclaimed Aramis, opening his eyes in real astonishment. "Yes," said Baisemeaux, greatly disturbed by the glance which the prelate fixed upon him. "At Monsieur Fouquet's, certainly." "There is no harm in that, dear Monsieur Baisemeaux. Only I would ask, why ask my address of Monsieur Fouquet?" "That I might write to you." "I understand," said Aramis, smiling, "but that is not what I meant. I do not ask you what you required my address for. I only ask why you should go to Monsieur Fouquet for it." "Oh," said Baisemeaux, "as Belle Isle is the property of Monsieur Fouquet, and as Belle Isle is in the diocese of Vannes, and as you are the bishop of Vannes—" "But, my dear Baisemeaux, since you knew I was bishop of Vannes, you had no occasion to ask Monsieur Fouquet for my address." "Well, monsieur," said Baisemeaux, completely at bay, "if I had acted indiscreetly, I beg your pardon most sincerely." "Nonsense," observed Aramis, calmly. "How can you possibly have acted indiscreetly?" And while he composed his face, and continued to smile cheerfully on the governor, he was considering how Baisemeaux, who was not aware of his address, knew, however, that Vannes was his residence. "I shall clear all this up," he said to himself, and then speaking aloud, added, "Well, my dear governor, shall we now arrange our little accounts?" "I am at your orders, my lord. But tell me beforehand, my lord, whether you will do me the honor to breakfast with me as usual." "Very willingly, indeed." "That's well," said Baisemeaux, as he struck the bell before him 3 times. "What does that mean?" inquired Aramis. "That I have some one to breakfast with me, and that preparations are to be made accordingly." "And you rang thrice? Really, my dear governor, I begin to think you are acting ceremoniously with me." "No, indeed. Besides, the least I can do is to receive you in the best way I can." "But why so?" "Because not even a prince could have done what you have done for me." "Nonsense, nonsense." "Nay, I assure you." "Let us speak of other matters," said Aramis, "or rather, tell me how your affairs here are getting on." "Not over well." "The deuce! Monsieur de Mazarin was not hard enough." "Yes, I see. You require a government full of suspicion, like that of the old cardinal, for instance. Yes, matters went on better under him. The brother of his grey eminence made his fortune here. Believe me, my dear governor, said Aramis, drawing closer to Baisemeaux, a young king is well worth an old cardinal. Youth has its suspicions, its fits of anger, its prejudices, as old age has its hatreds, its precautions, and its fears. Have you paid your 3 years' profits to Louvidre and Tremblay? Most certainly I have. So you have nothing more to give them than the 50,000 francs I have brought with me? Nothing. Have you not saved anything, then? My lord, in giving the 50,000 francs of my own to these gentlemen, I assure you that I gave them everything I gain. I told Monsieur d'Artagnan so yesterday evening. Ah, said Aramis, whose eyes sparkled for a moment, but became immediately afterwards as unmoved as before. So you have been to see my old friend D'Artagnan? How was he? Wonderfully well. And what did you say to him, Monsieur de Baisemeaux? I told him, continued the governor, not perceiving his own thoughtlessness, I told him that I fed my prisoners too well. How many have you? Inquired Aramis, in an indifferent tone of voice. 60. Well, that is a tolerably round number. In former times, my lord, there were, during certain years, as many as 200. Still, a minimum of 60 is not to be grumbled at. Perhaps not, for to anybody but myself, each prisoner would bring in 250 pistoles. For instance, for a prince of the blood, I have 50 francs a day. Only you have no prince of the blood, at least I suppose so, said Aramis, with a slight tremor in his voice. No, thank heavens. I mean, no, unfortunately. What do you mean by unfortunately? Because my appointment would be improved by it. So 50 francs per day for a prince of the blood, 36 for a marechal of France. But you have as many marechals of France, I suppose, as you have princes of the blood? Alas, no more. It is true lieutenant generals and brigadiers pay 26 francs, and I have 2 of them. After that come councillors of parliament, who bring me 15 francs, and I have 6 of them. I did not know, said Aramis, that councillors were so productive. Yes, but from 15 francs I sink at once to 10 francs, namely, for an ordinary judge and for an ecclesiastic. And you have 7, you say? An excellent affair. Nay, a bad one, and for this reason. How can I possibly treat these poor fellows, who are of some good, at all events, otherwise than as a councillor of parliament? Yes, you are right. I do not see 5 francs difference between them. You understand, if I have a fine fish, I pay 4 or 5 francs for it. If I get a fine fowl, it costs me 1.5 francs. I fatten a good deal of poultry, but I have to buy grain, and you cannot imagine the army of rats that infest this place. Why not get half a dozen cats to deal with them? Cats indeed, yes, they eat them, but I was obliged to give up the idea because of the way in which they treated my grain. I have been obliged to have some terrier dogs sent me from England to kill the rats. These dogs, unfortunately, have tremendous appetites. They eat as much as a prisoner of the 5th order, without taking into account the rabbits and the fowls they kill. Was Aramis really listening or not? No one could have told. His downcast eyes showed the attentive man, but the restless hand betrayed the man absorbed in thought. Aramis was meditating. I was saying, continued Baisemeaux, that a good-sized fowl costs me 1.5 francs, and that a fine fish costs me 4 or 5 francs. 3 meals are served at the Bastille, and, as the prisoners, having nothing to do, are always eating, a 10-franc man costs me 7.5 francs. But did you not say that you treated those at 10 francs like those at 15? Yes, certainly. Very well. Then you gain 7.5 francs upon those who pay you 15 francs. I must compensate myself somehow, said Baisemeaux, who saw how he had been snapped up. You are quite right, my dear governor. But have you no prisoners below 10 francs? Ah, yes, we have citizens and barristers at 5 francs. And do they eat too? Not a doubt about it. Only you understand that they do not get fish or poultry, nor rich wines at every meal, but at all events thrice a week They have a good dish at their dinner. Really, you are quite a philanthropist, my dear governor, and you will ruin yourself. No, understand me. When the 15 franc has not eaten his fowl, or the 10 franc has left his dish unfinished, I send it to the 5 franc prisoner. It is a feast for the poor devil, and one must be charitable, you know. And what do you make out of your 5 franc prisoners? 1.5 francs. Baisemeaux, you're an honest fellow. In honest truth, I say so. Thank you, my lord. But I feel most for the small tradesmen and bailiffs' clerks, who are rated at 3 francs. They do not often see Rhine carp or Channel sturgeon. But do not the 5 franc gentlemen sometimes leave some scraps? Oh, my lord, do not believe I am so stingy as that. I delight the heart of some poor little tradesman or clerk by sending him a wing of a red partridge, a slice of venison, or a slice of a truffled pasty, dishes which he never tasted except in his dreams. These are the leavings of the 24 franc prisoners, and as he eats and drinks, at dessert he cries, "Long live the king," and blesses the Bastile. With a couple of bottles of champagne, which cost me 5 sous, I make him tipsy every Sunday. That class of people call down blessings upon me, and are sorry to leave the prison. Do you know that I have remarked, and it does me infinite honour, that certain prisoners who have been set at liberty have, almost immediately afterwards, got imprisoned again? Why should this be the case, unless it be to enjoy the pleasures of my kitchen? It is really the fact. Aramis smiled with an expression of incredulity. You smile, said Baisemeaux. I do, returned Aramis. I tell you that we have names which have been inscribed on our books thrice in the space of 2 years. I must see it before I believe it, said Aramis. Well, I can show it to you, although it is prohibited to communicate the registers to strangers, and if you really wish to see it with your own eyes, I should be delighted, I confess. Very well, said Baisemeaux, and he took out of a cupboard a large register. Aramis followed him most anxiously with his eyes, and Baisemeaux returned, placed the register upon the table, and turned over the leaves for a minute, and stayed at the letter M. Look here, said he, Martinier, January 1659, Martinier, June 1660, Martinier, March 1661, Mazarinades, etc. You understand, it was only a pretext. People were not sent to the Bastile for jokes against Monsieur Mazarin. The fellow denounced himself in order to get imprisoned here. And what was his object? None other than to return to my kitchen at 3 francs a day. 3 francs, poor devil! The poet, my lord, belongs to the lowest scale, the same style of board as the small tradesman and bailiff's clerk. But I repeat, it is to those people that I give these little surprises. Aramis mechanically turned over the leaves of the register, continuing to read the names, but without appearing to take any interest in the names he read. In 1661, you perceive, said Baisemeaux, 80 entries, and in 1659, 80 also. Ah, said Aramis, Seldon, I seem to know that name. Was it not you who spoke to me about a certain young man? Yes, a poor devil of a student who made, what do you call that where 2 Latin verses rhyme together? A distich. Yes, that is it. Poor fellow, for a distich. Do you know that he made this distich against the Jesuits? That makes no difference. The punishment seems very severe. Do not pity him. Last year you seemed to interest yourself in him. Yes, I did so. Well, as your interest is all powerful here, my lord, I have treated him, since that time, as a prisoner at 15 francs. The same as this one, then, said Aramis, who had continued turning over the leaves, and who had stopped at one of the names which followed Martinier. Yes, the same as that one. Is that Marchiali in Italian? Said Aramis, pointing with his finger to the name which had attracted his attention. Hush! Said Baisemeaux. Why hush? Said Aramis, involuntarily clenching his right hand. I thought I had already spoken to you about that Marchiali. No, it is the first time I have ever heard his name pronounced. That may be, but perhaps I have spoken to you about him without naming him. Is he an old offender? Asked Aramis, attempting to smile. On the contrary, he is quite young. And his crime, then, very heinous? Unpardonable. Has he assassinated any one? Bah! An incendiary, then? Bah! Has he slandered any one? No, no, no. It is he who... And Baisemeaux approached Aramis's ear, making a sort of ear trumpet of his hands, and whispered, "It is he who presumes to resemble the..." "Yes, yes," said Aramis. "I now remember you already spoke about it last year to me. But the crime appeared to me so slight." "Slight, do you say? Or rather so involuntary?" "My lord, it is not involuntary that such a resemblance is detected." "Well, the fact is, I had forgotten it. But, my dear host," said Aramis, closing the register, "if I am not mistaken, we are summoned." Baisemeaux took the register, hastily restored it to its place in the closet, which he locked, and put the key in his pocket. "Will it be agreeable to your lordship to breakfast now?" said he, "for you are right in supposing that breakfast was announced." "Assuredly, my dear governor." And they passed into the dining room. Chapter 24. Of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 years later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 24. The breakfast at Monsieur de Baisemeaux's. Aramis was generally temperate, but on this occasion, while taking every care of his constitution, he did ample justice to Baisemeaux's breakfast, which, in all respects, was most excellent. The latter, on his side, was animated with the wildest gaiety. The sight of the 5,000 pistoles, which he glanced at from time to time, seemed to open his heart. Every now and then he looked at Aramis with an expression of the deepest gratitude, while the latter, leaning back in his chair, took a few sips of wine from his glass, with the air of a connoisseur. "Let me never hear any ill words against the fare of the Bastile," said he, half closing his eyes. "Happy are the prisoners who can get only a half bottle of such Burgundy every day." "All those at 15 francs drink it," said Baisemeaux. "It is very old Volnay." "Does that poor student Seldon drink such good wine?" "Oh, no." "I thought I heard you say he was boarded at 15 francs." "He? No, indeed. A man who makes districts, I mean, at 15 francs? No, no. It is his neighbour who is at 15 francs." "Which neighbour?" "The other, second Bertaudiere." "Excuse me, my dear governor, but you speak a language which requires quite an apprenticeship to understand." "Very true," said the governor. "Allow me to explain. Second Bertaudiere is the person who occupies the second floor of the tower of the Bertaudiere." "So that Bertaudiere is the name of one of the towers of the Bastile?" "The fact is, I think I recollect hearing that each tower has a name of its own. Whereabouts is the one you are speaking of?" "Look," said Baisemeaux, going to the window. "It is that tower to the left, the second one." "Is the prisoner at 15 francs there?" "Yes." "Since when?" 7 or 8 years, nearly." "What? What do you mean by nearly? Do you not know the dates more precisely?" "It was not in my time, Monsieur d'Herblay." "But I should have thought that Louviere or Tremblay would have told you. The secrets of the Bastile are never handed over with the keys of the governorship." "Indeed. Then the cause of his imprisonment is a mystery, a state secret." "Oh, no, I do not suppose it is a state secret, but a secret, like everything that happens at the Bastile." "But," said Aramis, "why do you speak more freely of Seldon than of the second Bertaudiere?" "Because, in my opinion, the crime of the man who writes a distich is not so great as that of the man who resembles..." "Yes, yes, I understand you. Still, do not the turnkeys talk with your prisoners?" "Of course." "The prisoners, I suppose, tell them they are not guilty?" "They are always telling them that. It is a matter of course, the same song over and over again." But does not the resemblance you were speaking about just now strike the turnkeys? My dear Monsieur d'Herblay, it is only for men attached to the court, as you are, to take trouble about such matters. You're right, my dear Monsieur Baisemeaux. Let me give you another taste of this Volnay. Not a taste merely, a full glass. Fill yours too. Nay, nay, you are a musketeer still, to the very tips of your fingers, while I have become a bishop. A taste for me, a glass for yourself. As you please. And Aramis and the governor nodded to each other as they drank their wine. But, said Aramis, looking with fixed attention at the ruby-coloured wine he had raised to the level of his eyes, as if he wished to enjoy it with all his senses at the same moment, but what you might call a resemblance, another would not, perhaps, take any notice of. Most certainly he would, though, if it were any one who knew the person he resembles. I really think, Monsieur de Baisemeaux, that it can be nothing more than a resemblance of your own creation. Upon my honour, it is not so. Stay, continued Aramis, I have seen many persons very like the one we are speaking of, but out of respect, no one ever said anything about it. Very likely, because there is resemblance and resemblance. This is a striking one, and, if you were to see him, you would admit it to be so. If I were to see him, indeed, said Aramis, in an indifferent tone, but in all probability I never shall. Why not? Because, if I were even to put my foot inside one of those horrible dungeons, I should fancy I was buried there for ever. No, no, the cells are very good places to live in. I really do not and cannot believe it, and that is a fact. Pray, do not speak of second Bertaudiere. It is really a good room, very nicely furnished and carpeted. The young fellow has by no means been unhappy there. The best lodging the Bastile affords has been his. There is a chance for you. Nay, nay, said Aramis coldly, you will never make me believe there are any good rooms in the Bastile. And as for your carpets, they exist only in your imagination. I should find nothing but spiders, rats, and perhaps toads too. Toads? cried Baisemeaux. Yes, in the dungeons. Ah, I don't say there are not toads in the dungeons, replied Baisemeaux, but will you be convinced by your own eyes? He continued, with a sudden impulse. No, certainly not. Not even to satisfy yourself of the resemblance which you deny, as you do the carpets? Some spectral-looking person, a mere shadow, an unhappy, dying man. Nothing of the kind. As brisk and vigorous a young fellow as ever lived. Melancholy and ill-tempered, then? Not at all. Very gay and lively. Nonsense, you are joking. Will you follow me? Said Baisemeaux. What for? To go the round of the Bastile. Why? You will then see for yourself. See with your own eyes. But the regulations? Never mind them. To-day my major has leave of absence. The lieutenant is visiting the post on the bastions. We are sole masters of the situation. No, no, my dear governor. Why, the very idea of the sound of the bolts makes me shudder. You will only have to forget me in second or fourth Bertaudiere, and then you are refusing an opportunity that may never present itself again. Do you know that, to obtain the favour I propose to you gratis, some of the princes of the blood have offered me as much as 50,000 francs? Really? He must be worth seeing, then. Forbidden fruit, my lord, forbidden fruit. You who belong to the church ought to know that. Well, if I had any curiosity, it would be to see the poor author of the distich. Very well, we will see him too. But if I were at all curious, it would be about the beautiful carpeted room and its lodger. Furniture is very commonplace, and a face with no expression in it offers little or no interest. But a boarder at 15 francs is always interesting. By the by, I forgot to ask you about that. Why 15 francs for him, and only 3 francs for poor Seldon? The distinction made in that instance was a truly noble act, and one which displayed the king's goodness of heart to great advantage. The king's, you say? The cardinal's, I mean. "This unhappy man," said Monsieur Mazarin, "is destined to remain in prison forever." "Why so?" "Why, it seems that his crime is a lasting one, and consequently his punishment ought to be so too." "Lasting?" "No doubt of it, unless he is fortunate enough to catch the smallpox, and even that is difficult, for we never get any impure air here." "Nothing can be more ingenious than your train of reasoning, my dear Monsieur Baisemeaux. Do you, however, mean to say that this unfortunate man must suffer without interruption or termination?" "I did not say he was to suffer, my lord. A 15-franc boarder does not suffer." "He suffers imprisonment, at all events." "No doubt there is no help for that, but this suffering is sweetened for him. You must admit that this young fellow was not born to eat all the good things he does eat; for instance, such things as we have on the table now, this pasty that has not been touched, these crawfish from the river Marne, of which we have hardly taken any, and which are almost as large as lobsters. All these things will at once be taken to second Bertaudiere, with a bottle of that Volnay which you think so excellent. After you have seen it, you will believe it, I hope." "Yes, my dear governor, certainly. But all this time you are thinking only of your very happy 15-franc prisoner, and you forget poor Seldon, my protege." "Well, out of consideration for you, it shall be a gala day for him. He shall have some biscuits and preserves with this small bottle of port." "You are a good-hearted fellow. I have said so already, and I repeat it, my dear Baisemeaux." "Well, let us set off then," said the governor, a little bewildered, partly from the wine he had drunk, and partly from Aramis's praises. "Do not forget that I only go to oblige you," said the prelate. "Very well, but you will thank me when you get there." "Let us go then." "Wait until I have summoned the jailer," said Baisemeaux, as he struck the bell twice, at which summons a man appeared. "I am going to visit the towers," said the governor. "No guards, no drums, no noise at all." "If I were not to leave my cloak here," said Aramis, pretending to be alarmed, "I should really think I was going to prison on my own account." The jailer preceded the governor, Aramis walking on his right hand. Some of the soldiers who happened to be in the courtyard drew themselves up in a line, as stiff as posts, as the governor passed along. Baisemeaux led the way down several steps which conducted to a sort of esplanade; thence they arrived at the drawbridge, where the sentinels on duty received the governor with the proper honors. The governor turned towards Aramis, and speaking in such a tone that the sentinels could not lose a word, he observed, "I hope you have a good memory, monsieur." "Why?" inquired Aramis. "On account of your plans and your measurements; for you know that no one is allowed, not architects even, to enter where the prisoners are, with paper, pens, or pencil." "Good," said Aramis to himself. "It seems I am an architect, then. It sounds like one of D'Artagnan's jokes, who perceived in me the engineer of Belle Isle." Then he added aloud, "Be easy on that score, monsieur. In our profession, a mere glance and a good memory are quite sufficient." Baisemeaux did not change countenance, and the soldiers took Aramis for what he seemed to be. "Very well, we will first visit La Bertaudiere," said Baisemeaux, still intending the sentinels to hear him. Then, turning to the jailer, he added, "You will take the opportunity of carrying to number 2 the few dainties I pointed out." "Dear Monsieur Baisemeaux," said Aramis, "you are always forgetting number 3." "So I am," said the governor, and upon that they began to ascend. The number of bolts, gratings, and locks for this single courtyard would have sufficed for the safety of an entire city. Aramis was neither an imaginative nor a sensitive man. He had been somewhat of a poet in his youth, but his heart was hard and indifferent, as the heart of every man of 55 years of age is, who has been frequently and passionately attached to women in his lifetime, or rather, who has been passionately loved by them. But when he placed his foot upon the worn stone steps, along which so many unhappy wretches had passed, when he felt himself impregnated, as it were, with the atmosphere of those gloomy dungeons, moistened with tears, there could be but little doubt He was overcome by his feelings, for his head was bowed, and his eyes became dim, as he followed Baisemeaux without a syllable. Chapter 25. Of 10 years later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 years later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 25. The second floor of La Bertaudiere. On the second flight of stairs, whether from fatigue or emotion, the breathing of the visitor began to fail him, and he leaned against the wall. "Will you begin with this one?" said Baisemeaux. "For since we are going to both, it matters very little whether we ascend from the second to the third story, or descend from the third to the second." "No, no," exclaimed Aramis eagerly. "Higher, if you please. The one above is the more urgent." They continued their ascent. "Ask the jailer for the keys," whispered Aramis. Baisemeaux did so, took the keys, and himself opened the door of the third room. The jailer was the first to enter. He placed upon the table the provisions, which the kind-hearted governor called dainties, and then left the room. The prisoner had not stirred. Baisemeaux then entered, while Aramis remained at the threshold, from which place he saw a youth about 18 years of age, who, raising his head at the unusual noise, jumped off the bed as he perceived the governor, and clasping his hands together began to cry out, "My mother, my mother!" in tones which betrayed such deep distress that Aramis, despite his command over himself, felt a shudder pass through his frame. "My dear boy," said Baisemeaux, endeavouring to smile, "I have brought you a diversion and an extra, the one for the mind, the other for the body. This gentleman has come to take your measure, and here are some preserves for your dessert." "Oh, monsieur!" exclaimed the young man, "keep me in solitude for a year. Let me have nothing but bread and water for a year. But tell me that at the end of a year I shall leave this place. Tell me that at the end of a year I shall see my mother again." "But I have heard you say that your mother was very poor, and that you were very badly lodged when you were living with her, while here, upon my word—" "If she were poor, monsieur, the greater reason to restore her only means of support to her. Badly lodged with her! Oh, monsieur, every one is always well lodged when he is free. At all events, since you yourself admit you have done nothing but write that unhappy distich, but without any intention, I swear, let me be punished, cut off the hand which wrote it. I will work with the other, but restore my mother to me." "My boy," said Baisemeaux, "you know very well that it does not depend upon me. All I can do for you is to increase your rations, give you a glass of port wine now and then, slip in a biscuit for you between a couple of plates." "Great heaven!" exclaimed the young man, falling backward and rolling on the ground. Aramis, unable to bear the scene any longer, withdrew as far as the landing. "Unhappy, wretched man!" he murmured. "Yes, monsieur, he is indeed very wretched," said the jailer, "but it is his parents' fault." "In what way?" "No doubt. Why did they let him learn Latin? Too much knowledge, you see, it is that which does harm. Now I, for instance, can't read or write, and therefore I am not in prison." Aramis looked at the man, who seemed to think that being a jailer in the Bastile was not being in prison. As for Baisemeaux, noticing the little effect produced by his advice and his port wine, he left the dungeon quite upset. "You have forgotten to close the door," said the jailer. "So I have," said Baisemeaux. "There are the keys, you do it." "I will solicit the pardon of that boy," said Aramis. "And if you do not succeed," said Baisemeaux, "at least beg that he may be transferred to the 10-franc list, by which both he and I shall be gainers." "If the other prisoner calls out for his mother in a similar manner," said Aramis, "I prefer not to enter at all, but will take my measure from outside." "No fear of that, monsieur architect. The one we are going now to see is as gentle as a lamb. Before he could call after his mother, he must open his lips, and he never says a word." "Let us go in, then," said Aramis, gloomily. "Are you the architect of the prisons, monsieur?" said the jailer. "I am." "It is odd, then, that you are not more accustomed to all this." Aramis perceived that, to avoid giving rise to any suspicions, he must summon all his strength of mind to his assistance. Baisemeaux, who carried the keys, opened the door. "Stay outside," he said to the jailer, "and wait for us at the bottom of the steps." The jailer obeyed and withdrew. Baisemeaux entered first, and opened the second door himself. By the light which filtered through the iron-barred window could be seen a handsome young man, short in stature, with closely cut hair and a beard beginning to grow. He was sitting on a stool, his elbow resting on an armchair, and with all the upper part of his body reclining against it. His dress, thrown upon the bed, was of rich black velvet, and he inhaled the fresh air which blew in upon his breast through a shirt of the very finest cambric. As the governor entered, the young man turned his head with a look full of indifference, and on recognizing Baisemeaux, he arose and saluted him courteously. But when his eyes fell upon Aramis, who remained in the background, the latter trembled, turned pale, and his hat, which he held in his hand, fell upon the ground, as if all his muscles had become relaxed at once. Baisemeaux, habituated to the presence of his prisoner, did not seem to share any of the sensations which Aramis experienced, but, with all the zeal of a good servant, he busied himself in arranging on the table the pasty and crawfish he had brought with him. Occupied in this manner, he did not remark how disturbed his guest had become. When he had finished, however, he turned to the young prisoner and said, "You are looking very well. Are you so?" "Quite well, I thank you, monsieur," replied the young man. The effect of the voice was such as almost to overpower Aramis, and notwithstanding his control over himself, he advanced a few steps towards him, with his eyes wide open and his lips trembling. The movement he made was so marked that Baisemeaux, notwithstanding his preoccupation, observed it. "This gentleman is an architect who has come to examine your chimney," said Baisemeaux. "Does it smoke?" "Never, monsieur." "You were saying just now," said the governor, rubbing his hands together, "that it was not possible for a man to be happy in prison. Here, however, is one who is so. You have nothing to complain of, I hope?" "Nothing." "Do you ever feel weary?" said Aramis. "Never." "Ha, ha," said Baisemeaux, in a low tone of voice, "was I right? Well, my dear governor, it is impossible not to yield to evidence. Is it allowed to put any question to him?" "As many as you like." "Very well. Be good enough to ask him if he knows why he is here." "This gentleman requests me to ask you," said Baisemeaux, "if you are aware of the cause of your imprisonment." "No, monsieur," said the young man, unaffectedly, "I am not." "That is hardly possible," said Aramis, carried away by his feelings in spite of himself. "If you were really ignorant of the cause of your detention, you would be furious." "I was so in the early days of my imprisonment." "Why are you not so now?" "Because I have reflected." "That is strange," said Aramis. "Is it not odd?" said Baisemeaux. "May one venture to ask you, monsieur, on what you have reflected?" "I felt that as I had committed no crime, Heaven could not punish me." "What is a prison, then," inquired Aramis, "if not a punishment?" "Alas, I cannot tell," said the young man. "All that I can tell you now is the very opposite of what I felt 7 years ago. To hear you converse, to witness your resignation, one might almost believe that you liked your imprisonment." "I endure it." "In the certainty of recovering your freedom some day, I suppose." "I have no certainty. Hope I have, and that is all. And yet I acknowledge that this hope becomes less every day." "Still, why should you not again be free, since you have already been so?" "That is precisely the reason," replied the young man, "which prevents me from expecting liberty. Why should I have been imprisoned at all, if it had been intended to release me afterwards?" "How old are you?" "I do not know." "What is your name?" "I have forgotten the name by which I was called." "Who are your parents?" "I never knew them." "But those who brought you up?" "They did not call me their son." "Did you ever love any one before coming here?" I loved my nurse and my flowers. Was that all? I also loved my valet. Do you regret your nurse and your valet? I wept very much when they died. Did they die since you have been here, or before you came? They died the evening before I was carried off. Both at the same time? Yes, both at the same time. In what manner were you carried off? A man came for me, directed me into a carriage, which was closed and locked, and brought me here. Would you be able to recognize that man again? He was masked. Is this not an extraordinary tale? Said Baisemeaux in a low tone of voice to Aramis, who could hardly breathe. It is indeed extraordinary, he murmured. But what is still more extraordinary is, that he has never told me so much as he has just told you. Perhaps the reason may be that you have never questioned him, said Aramis. It's possible, replied Baisemeaux. I have no curiosity. Have you looked at the room? It's a fine one, is it not? Very much so. A carpet. Beautiful. I'll wager he had nothing like it before he came here. I think so too. And then again turning towards the young man, he said, do you not remember to have been visited at some time or another by a strange lady or gentleman? Yes, indeed, thrice by a woman, who each time came to the door in a carriage, and entered covered with a veil, which she raised when we were together and alone. Do you remember that woman? Yes. What did she say to you? The young man smiled mournfully, and then replied, she inquired, as you have just done, if I were happy, and if I were getting weary. What did she do on arriving and on leaving you? She pressed me in her arms, held me in her embrace, and kissed me. Do you remember her? Perfectly. Do you recall her features distinctly? Yes. You would recognize her, then, if accident brought her before you, or led you into her person? Most certainly. A flush of fleeting satisfaction passed across Aramis's face. At this moment Baisemeaux heard the jailer approaching. Shall we leave? He said hastily to Aramis. Aramis, who probably had learnt all that he cared to know, replied, when you like. The young man saw them prepare to leave, and saluted them politely. Baisemeaux replied merely by a nod of the head, while Aramis, with a respect, arising perhaps from the sight of such misfortune, saluted the prisoner profoundly. They left the room, Baisemeaux closing the door behind him. Well, said Baisemeaux, as they descended the staircase, what do you think of it all? I have discovered the secret, my dear governor, he said. Bah! What is the secret, then? A murder was committed in that house? Nonsense. But attend, the valet and nurse died the same day. Well, and by poison, what do you think? That is very likely to be true. What? That the young man is an assassin? Who said that? What makes you think that poor young fellow could be an assassin? The very thing I was saying. A crime was committed in his house, said Aramis, and that was quite sufficient. Perhaps he saw the criminals, and it was feared that he might say something. The deuce! If I only thought that... Well, I would redouble the surveillance. Oh, he does not seem to wish to escape. You do not know what prisoners are. Has he any books? None. They are strictly prohibited under M. de Mazarin's own hand. Have you the writing still? Yes, my lord. Would you like to look at it as you return to take your cloak? I should, for I like to look at autographs. Well, then, this one is of the most unquestionable authenticity. There is only one erasure. Ah, an erasure. And in what respect? With respect to a figure. At first there was written, to be boarded at 50 francs. As princes of the blood, in fact. But the cardinal must have seen his mistake, you understand, for he cancelled the 0, and has added a 1 before the 5. But by the by, what? You do not speak of the resemblance. I do not speak of it, dear Monsieur de Baisemeaux, for a very simple reason, because it does not exist. The deuce it doesn't. Or if it does exist, it is only in your own imagination. But supposing if it were to exist elsewhere, I think it would be better for you not to speak about it. Really, the king, Louis XIV, you understand, would be excessively angry with you if he were to learn that you contributed in any way to spread the report that one of his subjects has the effrontery to resemble him." "It is true, quite true," said Baisemeaux, thoroughly alarmed. "But I have not spoken of the circumstance to any one but yourself, and you understand, monseigneur, that I perfectly rely on your discretion." "Oh, be easy. Do you still wish to see the note?" "Certainly." While engaged in this manner in conversation, they had returned to the governor's apartments. Baisemeaux took from the cupboard a private register, like the one he had already shown Aramis, but fastened by a lock, the key which opened it being one of a small bunch which Baisemeaux always carried with him. Then placing the book upon the table, he opened it at the letter M, and showed Aramis the following note in the column of observations: "No books at any time, all linen and clothes of the finest and best quality to be procured. No exercise. Always the same jailer. No communications with any one. Musical instruments, every liberty and every indulgence which his welfare may require. To be boarded at 15 francs. Monsieur de Baisemeaux can claim more if the 15 francs be not sufficient." "Ah," said Baisemeaux, "now I think of it, I shall claim it." Aramis shut the book. "Yes," he said, "it is indeed Monsieur de Mazarin's handwriting. I recognize it well. Now, my dear governor," he continued, as if this last communication had exhausted his interest, "let us now turn over to our own little affairs." "Well, what time for repayment do you wish me to take? Fix it yourself." "There need not be any particular period fixed. Give me a simple acknowledgement for 150,000 francs." "When to be made payable?" "When I require it; but you understand, I shall only wish it when you yourself do." "Oh, I am quite easy on that score," said Baisemeaux, smiling; "but I have already given you 2 receipts." "Which I now destroy," said Aramis; and after having shown the 2 receipts to Baisemeaux, he destroyed them. Overcome by so great a mark of confidence, Baisemeaux unhesitatingly wrote out an acknowledgement of a debt of 150,000 francs, payable at the pleasure of the prelate. Aramis, who had, by glancing over the governor's shoulder, followed the pen as he wrote, put the acknowledgement into his pocket without seeming to have read it, which made Baisemeaux perfectly easy. "Now," said Aramis, "you will not be angry with me if I were to carry off one of your prisoners?" "What do you mean?" "By obtaining his pardon, of course. Have I not already told you that I took a great interest in the poor Seldon?" "Yes, quite true, you did so." "Well, that is your affair. Do as you think proper. I see you have an open hand, and an arm that can reach a great way. Adieu, adieu." And Aramis left, carrying with him the governor's best wishes. Chapter 26
of 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 26 The Two Friends. At the very time Monsieur de Baisemeaux was showing Aramis the prisoners in the Bastile, a carriage drew up at Madame de Belliere's door, and, at that still early hour, a young woman alighted, her head muffled in a silk hood. When the servants announced Madame Vanel to Madame de Belliere, the latter was engaged, or rather was absorbed, in reading a letter, which she hurriedly concealed. She had hardly finished her morning toilette, her maid being still in the next room. At the name, at the footsteps of Marguerite Vanel, Madame de Belliere ran to meet her. She fancied she could detect in her friend's eyes a brightness which was neither that of health nor of pleasure. Marguerite embraced her, pressed her hands, and hardly allowed her time to speak. "Dearest," she said, "have you forgotten me? Have you quite given yourself up to the pleasures of the court?" "I have not even seen the marriage bets." What are you doing with yourself, then? I am getting ready to leave for Belliere. For Belliere? Yes. You are becoming rustic in your tastes, then. I delight to see you so disposed, but you are pale. No, I'm perfectly well. So much the better. I was becoming uneasy about you. You do not know what I have been told. People say so many things. Yes, but this is very singular. How well you know how to excite curiosity, Marguerite. Well, I was afraid of vexing you. Never. You have yourself always admired me for my evenness of temper. Well, then, it is said that... No, I shall never be able to tell you. Do not let us talk about it, then, said Madame de Belliere, who detected the ill nature that was concealed by all these prefaces, yet felt the most anxious curiosity on the subject. Well, then, my dear Marquise, it is said, for some time past you no longer continue to regret Monsieur de Belliere as you used to. It is an ill-natured report, Marguerite. I do regret, and shall always regret, my husband, but it is now 2 years since he died. I am only 28 years old, and my grief at his loss ought not always to control every action and thought of my life. You, Marguerite, who are the model of a wife, would not believe me if I were to say so. Why not? Your heart is so soft and yielding, she said, spitefully. Yours is so too, Marguerite, and yet I did not perceive that you allowed yourself to be overcome by grief when your heart was wounded. These words were in direct allusion to Marguerite's rupture with the superintendent, and were also a veiled but direct reproach made against her friend's heart. As if she only awaited the signal to discharge her shaft, Marguerite exclaimed, "Well, Elise, it is said you are in love!" and she looked fixedly at Madame de Belliere, who blushed against her will. "Woman can never escape slander," replied the marquise, after a moment's pause. "No one slanders you, Elise." "What? People say that I am in love, and yet they do not slander me." "In the first place, if it be true, it is no slander, but simply a scandal-loving report. In the next place, for you did not allow me to finish what I was saying, the public does not assert that you have abandoned yourself to this passion. It represents you, on the contrary, as a virtuous but loving woman, defending yourself with claws and teeth, shutting yourself up in your own house as in a fortress, in other respects as impenetrable as that of Danae, notwithstanding Danae's tower was made of brass." "You are witty, Marguerite," said Madame de Belliere, angrily. "You always flatter me, Elise. In short, however, you are reported to be incorruptible and unapproachable. You cannot decide whether the world is calumniating you or not. But what is it you are musing about while I am speaking to you?" "I?" "Yes, you are blushing and do not answer me." "I was trying," said the marquise, raising her beautiful eyes brightened with an indication of growing temper, "I was trying to discover what you could possibly have alluded, you who are so learned in mythological subjects, in comparing me to Danae." "You were trying to guess that?" said Marguerite, laughing. "Yes. Do you not remember that at the convent, when we were solving our problems in arithmetic, ah! what I have to tell you is learned also, but it is my turn. Do you not remember that if one of the terms were given, we were to find the other? Therefore, do you guess now?" "I cannot conjecture what you mean." "And yet nothing is more simple. You pretend that I am in love, do you not?" "So it is said." "Very well. It is not said, I suppose, that I am in love with an abstraction. There must surely be a name mentioned in this report." "Certainly, a name is mentioned." "Very well. It is not surprising, then, that I should try to guess this name, since you do not tell it." "My dear marquise, when I saw you blush, I did not think you would have to spend much time in conjectures." It was the word dîner which you used that surprised me. Dîner means a shower of gold, does it not? That is to say, that the Jupiter of Danae changed himself into a shower of gold for her. My lover, then, he whom you assign me. I beg your pardon, I am your friend and assign you no one. That may be, but those who are ill disposed towards me. Do you wish to hear the name? I have been waiting this half hour for it. Well, then, you shall hear it. Do not be shocked, he is a man high in power. Good, said the marquise, as she clenched her hands like a patient at the approach of the knife. He is a very wealthy man, continued Marguerite, the wealthiest, it may be. In a word, it is. The marquise closed her eyes for a moment. It is the Duke of Buckingham, said Marguerite, bursting into laughter. This perfidy had been calculated with extreme ability. The name that was pronounced, instead of the name which the marquise awaited, had precisely the same effect upon her as the badly sharpened axes that had hacked without destroying Messieurs de Chalais and de Thou upon the scaffold. She recovered herself, however, and said, I was perfectly right in saying you were a witty woman, for you are making the time pass away most agreeably. This joke is a most amusing one, for I have never seen the Duke of Buckingham. Never, said Marguerite, restraining her laughter. I have never even left my own house since the Duke has been at Paris. Oh, resumed Madame Vanel, stretching out her foot towards a paper which was lying on the carpet near the window. It is not necessary for people to see each other, since they can write. The marquise trembled, for this paper was the envelope of the letter she was reading as her friend had entered, and was sealed with the superintendent's arms. As she leaned back on the sofa on which she was sitting, Madame de Belliere covered the paper with the thick folds of her large silk dress, and so concealed it. Come, Marguerite, tell me, is it to tell me all these foolish reports that you have come to see me so early in the day? No, I came to see you, in the first place, and to remind you of those habits of our earlier days, so delightful to remember, when we used to wander about together at the Vincennes, and, sitting beneath an oak or in some sylvan shade, used to talk of those we loved, and who loved us. Do you propose that we should go out together now? My carriage is here, and I have 3 hours at my disposal. I am not dressed yet, Marguerite, but if you wish that we should talk together, we can, without going to the woods of Vincennes. Find in my own garden here beautiful trees, shady groves, a green sward covered with daisies and violets, the perfume of which can be perceived from where we are sitting. I regret your refusal, my dear marquise, for I wanted to pour out my whole heart into yours. I repeat again, Marguerite, my heart is yours just as much in this room, or beneath the lime trees in the garden here, as it would be under the oaks in the woods yonder. It is not the same thing for me. In approaching Vincennes, marquise, my ardent aspirations approach nearer to that object towards which they have for some days past been directed. The marquise suddenly raised her head. Are you surprised, then, that I am still thinking of Saint Mande? Of Saint Mande! Exclaimed Madame de Belliere, and the looks of both women met each other like two resistless swords. You, so proud! Said the marquise, disdainfully. I, so proud! Replied Madame Vanel. Such is my nature. I do not forgive neglect. I cannot endure infidelity. When I leave any one who weeps at my abandonment, I feel induced still to love him, but when others forsake me, and laugh at their infidelity, I love distractedly. Madame de Belliere could not restrain an involuntary movement. She is jealous, said Marguerite to herself. Then, continued the marquise, you are quite enamored of the Duke of Buckingham, I mean of Monsieur Fouquet? Elise felt the illusion, and her blood seemed to congeal in her heart. "And you wished to go to Vincennes, to Saint Mande even?" "I hardly know what I wished. You would have advised me, perhaps." "In what respect?" "You have often done so." "Most certainly I should not have done so in the present instance, for I do not forgive as you do. I am less loving, perhaps. When my heart has been once wounded, it remains so always." "But Monsieur Fouquet has not wounded you," said Marguerite Vanel with the most perfect simplicity. "You perfectly understand what I mean. Monsieur Fouquet has not wounded me. I do not know of either obligation or injury received at his hands, but you have reason to complain of him. You are my friend, and I am afraid I should not advise you as you would like." "Ah, you are prejudging the case." "The sighs you spoke of just now are more than indications." "You overwhelm me," said the young woman suddenly, as if collecting her whole strength, like a wrestler preparing for a last struggle. "You take only my evil dispositions and my weaknesses into calculation, and do not speak of my pure and generous feelings. If, at this moment, I feel instinctively attracted towards the superintendent, if I even make an advance to him, which, I confess, is very probable, my motive for it is, that Monsieur Fouquet's fate deeply affects me, and because he is, in my opinion, one of the most unfortunate men living." "Ah," said the marquise, placing her hand upon her heart, "something new, then, has occurred." "Do you not know it?" "I am utterly ignorant of everything about him," said Madame de Belliere, with the poignant anguish that suspends thought and speech, and even life itself. "In the first place, then, the king's favor is entirely withdrawn from Monsieur Fouquet, and conferred on Monsieur Colbert." "So it is stated." "It is very clear, since the discovery of the plot of Belle Isle." "I was told that the discovery of the fortifications there had turned out to Monsieur Fouquet's honor." Marguerite began to laugh in so cruel a manner that Madame de Belliere could at that moment have delightedly plunged a dagger in her bosom. "Dearest," continued Marguerite, "there is no longer any question of Monsieur Fouquet's honor; his safety is concerned. Before 3 days are past, the ruin of the superintendent will be complete." "Stay," said the marquise, in her turn smiling, "that is going a little fast." "I said 3 days because I wished to deceive myself with a hope, but probably the catastrophe will be complete within 24 hours." "Why so?" "For the simplest of all reasons, that Monsieur Fouquet has no more money." "In matters of finance, my dear Marguerite, some are without money today, who tomorrow can procure millions." "That might be Monsieur Fouquet's case when he had two wealthy and clever friends who amassed money for him, and wrung it from every possible or impossible source, but those friends are dead." "Money does not die, Marguerite. It may be concealed, but it can be looked for, bought and found." "You see things on the bright side, and so much the better for you. It is really very unfortunate that you are not the Egeria of Monsieur Fouquet. You might now show him the source whence he could obtain the millions which the king asked him for yesterday." "Millions!" said the marquise, in terror. "Four, an even number." "Infamous!" murmured Madame de Belliere, tortured by her friend's merciless delight. "Monsieur Fouquet, I should think, must certainly have 4 millions," she replied courageously. "If he has those which the king requires today," said Marguerite, "he will not, perhaps, possess those which the king will demand in a month or so." "The king will exact money from him again, then." "No doubt, and that is my reason for saying that the ruin of poor Monsieur Fouquet is inevitable. Pride will induce him to furnish the money, and when he has no more, he will fall." "It is true," said the marquise, trembling. "The plan is a bold one, but tell me, does Monsieur Colbert hate Monsieur Fouquet so very much?" "I think he does not like him. Monsieur Colbert is powerful, he improves on close acquaintance, he has gigantic ideas, a strong will, and discretion. He will rise." "He will be superintendent?" "It is probable. Such is the reason, my dear marquise, why I felt myself impressed in favor of that poor man who once loved and even adored me, and why, when I see him so unfortunate, I forgive his infidelity, which I have reason to believe he also regrets, and why, moreover, I should not have been disinclined to afford him some consolation or some good advice. He would have understood the step I had taken, and would have thought kindly of me for it. It is gratifying to be loved, you know. Men value love more highly when they are no longer blinded by its influence." The marquise, bewildered and overcome by these cruel attacks, which had been calculated with the greatest nicety and precision, hardly knew what to answer in return. She even seemed to have lost all power of thought. Her perfidious friend's voice had assumed the most affectionate tone. She spoke as a woman, but concealed the instincts of a wolf. "Well," said Madame de Belliere, who had a vague hope that Marguerite would cease to overwhelm a vanquished enemy, "why do you not go and see Monsieur Fouquet?" "Decidedly, marquise, you have made me reflect. No, it would be unbecoming for me to make the first advance. Monsieur Fouquet no doubt loves me, but he is too proud. I cannot expose myself to an affront. Besides, I have my husband to consider. You tell me nothing? Very well, I shall consult Monsieur Colbert on the subject." Marguerite rose smilingly, as though to take leave, but the marquise had not the strength to imitate her. Marguerite advanced a few paces, in order that she might continue to enjoy the humiliating grief in which her rival was plunged, and then said, suddenly, "You do not accompany me to the door, then?" The marquise rose, pale and almost lifeless, without thinking of the envelope which had occupied her attention so greatly at the commencement of the conversation, and which was revealed at the first step she took. She then opened the door of her oratory, and without even turning her head towards Marguerite Vanel, entered it, closing the door after her. Marguerite said, or rather muttered a few words, which Madame de Belliere did not even hear. As soon, however, as the marquise had disappeared, her envious enemy, not being able to resist the desire to satisfy herself that her suspicions were well founded, advanced stealthily like a panther, and seized the envelope. "Ah!" she said, gnashing her teeth, "it was indeed a letter from Monsieur Fouquet she was reading when I arrived," and then darted out of the room. During this interval, the marquise, having arrived behind the rampart, as it were, of her door, felt that her strength was failing her. For a moment she remained rigid, pale and motionless as a statue, and then, like a statue shaken on its base by an earthquake, tottered and fell inanimate on the carpet. The noise of the fall resounded at the same moment as the rolling of Marguerite's carriage leaving the hotel. End of chapter 26. The Two Friends. Recording by Prachi Pense, Wilmington, Delaware.
7 of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eden Ray Hedrick. 10 Years Later, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 27. Madame de Belliere's Plate. The blow had been the more painful on account of its being unexpected. It was some time before the marquise recovered herself, but once recovered, she began to reflect upon the events so heartlessly announced to her. She therefore returned, at the risk even of losing her life in the way, to that train of ideas which her relentless friend had forced her to pursue. Treason, then, deep menaces concealed under the semblance of public interest, such were Colbert's manoeuvres. A detestable delight at an approaching downfall, untiring efforts to attain this object, means of seduction no less wicked than the crime itself. Such were the weapons Marguerite employed. The crooked atoms of Descartes triumphed. To the man without compassion was united a woman without heart. The marquise perceived, with sorrow rather than indignation, that the king was an accomplice in the plot which betrayed the duplicity of Louis XIII in his advanced age, and the avarice of Mazarin at a period of life when he had not had the opportunity of gorging himself with French gold. The spirit of this courageous woman soon resumed its energy, no longer overwhelmed by indulgence in compassionate lamentations. The marquise was not one to weep when action was necessary, nor to waste time in bewailing a misfortune, as long as means still existed of relieving it. For some minutes she buried her face in her cold fingers, and then, raising her head, rang for her attendants with a steady hand, and with a gesture betraying a fixed determination of purpose. Her resolution was taken. "Is everything prepared for my departure?" she asked one of her female attendants who entered. "Yes, madame, but it was not expected that your ladyship would leave for Belliere for the next few days." "All my jewels and articles of value, then, are packed up?" "Yes, madame, but hitherto we had been in the habit of leaving them in Paris. Your ladyship does not generally take your jewels with you into the country." "But they are all in order, you say?" "Yes, in your ladyship's own room." "The gold plate?" "In the chest." "And the silver plate?" "In the great oak closet." The marquise remained silent for a few moments, then said calmly, "Let my goldsmith be sent for." Her attendants quitted the room to execute the order. The marquise, however, had entered her own room, and was inspecting her casket of jewels with the greatest attention. Never until now had she bestowed such close attention upon riches in which women take so much pride. Never until now had she looked at her jewels except for the purpose of making a selection according to their settings or their colours. On this occasion, however, she admired the size of the rubies and the brilliancy of the diamonds. She grieved over every blemish and every defect. She thought the gold light and the stones wretched. The goldsmith, as he entered, found her thus occupied. "Monsieur Faucheux," she said, "I believe you supplied me with my gold service?" "I did, your ladyship." "I do not now remember the amount of the account." "Of the new service, madame, or of that which Monsieur de Belliere presented you on your marriage? For I have furnished both." "First of all the new one." "The covers, the goblets, and the dishes with their covers, the eau épergne, the ice pails, the dishes for the preserves, and the tea and coffee urns, cost your ladyship 60,000 francs." "No more?" "Your ladyship thought the account very high." "Yes, yes, I remember, in fact, that it was dear, but it was the workmanship, I suppose." "Yes, madame, the designs, the chasings, all new patterns." "What proportion of the cost does the workmanship form? Do not hesitate to tell me." "A third of its value, madame." "There is the other service, the old one, that which belonged to my husband?" "Yes, madame, there is less workmanship in that than in the other. Its intrinsic value does not exceed 30,000 francs." 30,000, murmured the marquise. "But, Monsieur Faucheux, there is also the service which belonged to my mother, all that mass of plate which I did not wish to part with on account of the associations connected with it."
"Ah, madame, that would indeed be an excellent resource for those who, unlike your ladyship, might not be in position to keep their plate. In chasing that they worked in solid metal. But that service is no longer in fashion. Its weight is its only advantage."
"That is all I care about. How much does it weigh?"
50,000 livres at the very least. I do not allude to the enormous vases for the buffet, which alone weigh 5,000 livres, or 10,000 the pair."
130, murmured the marquise. "You are quite sure of your figures, Monsieur Faucheux?"
"The amount is entered in my books. Your ladyship is extremely methodical, I am aware."
"Let us now turn to another subject," said Madame de Belliere, and she opened one of her jewel boxes.
"I recognize these emeralds," said Monsieur Faucheux, "for it was I who had the setting of them.
They are the most beautiful in the whole court. No, I am mistaken. Madame de Chatillon has the most beautiful set. She had them from the Messieurs de Guise. But your set, madame, comes next." "What are they worth?" "Mounted?" "No, supposing I wished to sell them." "I know very well who would buy them," exclaimed Monsieur Faucheux. "That is the very thing I ask. They could be sold, then?" "All your jewels could be sold, madame. It is well known that you possess the most beautiful jewels in Paris. You are not changeable in your tastes. When you make a purchase, it is of the very best, and what you purchase you do not part with." "What could these emeralds be sold for, then?" 130,000 francs. The marquise wrote down upon her tablets the amounts which the jeweler mentioned. "The ruby necklace?" she said. "Are they balas rubies, madame?" "Here they are." "They are beautiful, magnificent. I did not know your ladyship had these stones." "What is their value?" 200,000 francs. The center one alone is worth 100,000. "I thought so," said the marquise. "As for diamonds, I have them in numbers: rings, necklaces, sprigs, earrings, clasps. Tell me their value, Monsieur Faucheux." The jeweler took his magnifying glass and scales, weighted and inspected them, and silently made his calculations. "These stones," he said, "must have cost your ladyship an income of 40,000 francs." "You value them at 800,000 francs?" "Nearly so." "It is about what I imagined. But the settings are not included?" "No, madame. But if I were called upon to sell or to buy, I should be satisfied with the gold of the settings alone as my profit upon the transaction. I should make a good 25,000 francs." "An agreeable sum." "Very much so, madame." "Will you then accept that profit, on condition of converting the jewels into money?" "But you do not intend to sell your diamonds, I suppose, madame?" exclaimed the bewildered jeweler. "Silence, Monsieur Faucheux. Do not disturb yourself about that. Give me an answer simply. You are an honorable man, with whom my family has dealt for 30 years. You knew my father and mother, whom your own father and mother served. I address you as a friend. Will you accept the gold of the settings in return for a sum of ready money to be placed in my hands?" 800,000 francs! It is enormous." "I know it." "Impossible to find." "Not so." "But reflect, madame, upon the effect which will be produced by the sale of your jewels." "No one need know it. You can get sets of false jewels made for me, similar to the real. Do not answer a word, I insist upon it. Sell them separately, sell the stones only." "In that way it is easy. Monsieur is looking out for some sets of jewels as well as single stones for madame's toilette. There will be a competition for them. I can easily dispose of 600,000 francs worth to monsieur. I am certain yours are the most beautiful." "When can you do so?" "In less than 3 days' time." "Very well. The remainder you will dispose of among private individuals. For the present, make me a contract of sale, payment to be made in 4 days." "I entreat you to reflect, madame, for if you force the sale you will lose 100,000 francs." "If necessary, I will lose 200. I wish everything to be settled this evening. Do you accept?" "I do, your ladyship. I will not conceal from you that I shall make 50,000 francs by the transaction." "So much the better for you. In what way shall I have the money?" "Either in gold or in bills of the Bank of Lyons, payable at Monsieur Colbert." "I agree," said the marquise eagerly. "Return home and bring the sum in question in notes as soon as possible." "Yes, madame, but for heaven's sake—" "Not a word, Monsieur Faucheux. By the by, I was forgetting the silver plate. What is the value of that which I have?" 50,000 francs, madame." "That makes 1,000,000," said the marquise to herself. "Monsieur Faucheux, you will take away with you both the gold and silver plate. I can assign, as a pretext, that I wish it remodeled on patterns more in accordance with my own taste. Melt it down, and return me its value in money at once." "It shall be done, your ladyship." "You will be good enough to place the money in a chest, and to direct one of your clerks to accompany the chest, and without my servant seeing him, and order him to wait for me in a carriage." "In Madame de Faucheux's carriage?" said the jeweler. "If you will allow it, and I will call for it at your house." "Certainly, your ladyship." "I will direct some of my servants to convey the plate to your house." The marquise rang. "Let the small van be placed at Monsieur Faucheux's disposal," she said. The jeweler bowed and left the house, directing that the van should follow him closely, saying aloud that the marquise was about to have her plate melted down in order to have other plate manufactured of a more modern style. 3 hours afterwards she went to M. Faucheux's house, and received from him 800 francs in gold enclosed in a chest, which one of the clerks could hardly carry toward Madame Faucheux's carriage, for Madame Faucheux kept her carriage. As the daughter of the president of a count, she had brought a marriage proportion of 30,000 crowns for her husband, who was syndic of the goldsmiths. These 30,000 crowns had become very fruitful during 20 years. The jeweller, though a millionaire, was a modest man. He had purchased a substantial carriage, built in 1648, 10 years after the king's birth. This carriage, or rather house upon wheels, excited the admiration of the whole quarter in which he resided. It was covered with allegorical paintings, and clouds scattered over with stars. The marquise entered this somewhat extraordinary vehicle, sitting opposite the clerk, who endeavoured to put his knees out of the way, afraid of even touching the marquise's dress. It was the clerk, too, who told the coachman, who was very proud of having a marquise to drive, to take the road to Saint-Mande. End of chapter 27.
Of 10 Years Later. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Filippo Gioacchini. 10 Years Later by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 28. The Dowry. Monsieur Faucheux's horses were serviceable animals, with thick-set knees and legs that had some difficulty in moving. Like the carriage, they belonged to the earlier part of the century. They were not as fleet as the English horses of Monsieur Fouquet, and consequently it took 2 hours to get to Saint-Mande. Their progress, it might be said, was majestic. Majesty, however, precludes hurry. The marquise stopped the carriage at the door so well known to her, although she had seen it only once, under circumstances, it will now be remembered, no less painful than those which brought her now to it again. She drew a key from her pocket and inserted it into the lock, pushed open the door, which noiselessly yielded to her touch, and directed the clerk to carry the chest upstairs to the first floor. The weight of the chest was so great that the clerk was obliged to get the coachman to assist him with it. They placed it in a small cabinet, anteroom, or boudoir rather, adjoining the saloon where we once saw Monsieur Fouquet at the marquise's feet. Madame de Belliere gave the coachman a louis, smiled gracefully at the clerk, and dismissed them both. She closed the door after them, and waited in the room, alone and barricaded. There was no servant to be seen about the rooms, but everything was prepared as though some invisible genius had divined the wishes and desires of an expected guest. The fire was laid, candles in the candelabra, refreshments upon the table, books scattered about, fresh-cut flowers in the vases. One might almost have imagined it an enchanted house. The marquise lighted the candles, inhaled the perfume of the flowers, sat down, and was soon plunged in profound thought. Her deep musings, melancholy though they were not untinged with a certain vague joy. Spread out before her was a treasure, a million wrung from her fortune, as a gleaner plucks the blue cornflower from the crown of flowers. She conjured up the sweetest dreams. Her principal thought, and one that took precedence of all others, was to devise means of leaving this money for Monsieur Fouquet, without his possibly learning from whom the gift had come. This idea, naturally enough, was the first to present itself to her mind. But although on reflection it appeared difficult to carry out, she did not despair of success. She would then ring to summon Monsieur Fouquet and make her escape, happier than if, instead of having given a million, she had herself found one. But being there, and having seen the boudoir so coquettishly decorated that it might almost be said the least particle of dust had but the moment before been removed by the servants, having observed the drawing room so perfectly arranged that it might almost be said her presence there had driven away the fairies who were its occupants, she asked herself if the glance or gaze of those whom she had displaced, whether spirits, fairies, elves, or human creatures, had not already recognized her. To secure success, it was necessary that some steps should be seriously taken, and it was necessary also that the superintendent should comprehend the serious position in which he was placed, in order to yield compliance with the generous fancies of a woman. All the fascinations of an eloquent friendship would be required to persuade him, and should this be insufficient, the maddening influence of a devoted passion, which, in its resolute determination to carry conviction, would not be turned aside. Was not the superintendent indeed known for his delicacy and dignity of feeling? Would he allow himself to accept from any woman that of which she had stripped herself? No, he would resist, and if any voice in the world could overcome his resistance, it would be the voice of the woman he loved. Another doubt, and that a cruel one, suggested itself to Madame de Belliere with a sharp, acute pain, like a dagger thrust. Did he really love her? Would that volatile mind, that inconstant heart, be likely to be fixed for a moment, even were it to gaze upon an angel? Was it not the same with Fouquet, notwithstanding his genius and his uprightness of conduct, as with those conquerors on the field of battle who shed tears when they had gained a victory? I must learn if it be so, and must judge of that for myself, said the marquise. Who can tell me whether that heart so coveted is not common to its impulses, and full of alloy? Who can tell if that mind, when the touchstone is applied to it, will not be found of a mean and vulgar character? Come, come, she said, this is doubting and hesitation too much. To be proof, she said, looking at the timepiece. It is now 7 o'clock, she said. He must have arrived. It is the hour for signing his papers. With a feverish impatience, she rose and walked towards the mirror, in which she smiled with a resolute smile of devotedness. She touched the spring and drew out the handle of a bell. Then, as if exhausted beforehand by the struggle she had just undergone, she threw herself to her knees, in utter abandonment, before a large couch, in which she buried her face in her trembling hands. 10 minutes afterwards she heard the spring of the door sound. The door moved upon invisible hinges, and Fouquet appeared. He looked pale, and seemed bowed down by the weight of some bitter reflection. He did not hurry, but simply came at the summons. The preoccupation of his mind must indeed have been very great, that a man so devoted to pleasure, for whom indeed pleasure meant everything, should obey such a summons so listlessly. The previous night, in fact, fertile in melancholy ideas, had sharpened his features, generally so noble in their indifference of expression, and had traced dark lines of anxiety around his eyes. Handsome and noble he still was, and the melancholy expression of his mouth, a rare expression with men, gave a new character to his features, by which his youth seemed to be renewed. Dressed in black, the lace in front of his chest much disarranged by his feverishly restless hand, the looks of the superintendent, full of dreamy reflection, were fixed upon the threshold of the room which he had so frequently approached in search of expected happiness. This gloomy gentleness of manner, this smiling sadness of expression, which had replaced his former excessive joy, produced an indescribable effect upon Madame de Belliere, who was regarding him at a distance. A woman's eye can read the face of the man she loves, its every feeling of pride, its every expression of suffering. It might almost be said that Heaven has graciously granted to women, on account of their very weakness, more than it has accorded to other creatures. They can conceal their own feelings from a man, but from them no man can conceal his. The marquise divined in a single glance the whole weight of the unhappiness of the superintendent. She divined a night passed without sleep, a day passed in deceptions. From that moment she was firm in her own strength, and she felt that she loved Fouquet beyond everything else. She arose and approached him, saying, "You wrote to me this morning to say you were beginning to forget me, and that I, whom you had not seen lately, had no doubt ceased to think of you. I have come to undeceive you, monsieur, and the more completely so, because there is one thing I can read in your eyes." "What is that, madame?" said Fouquet, astonished. "That you have never loved me so much as at this moment. In this same manner you can read, in my present step towards you, that I have not forgotten you." "Oh, madame," said Fouquet, whose face was for a moment lighted up by a sudden gleam of joy, "you are indeed an angel, and no man can suspect you. All he can do is to humble himself before you and entreat forgiveness." "Your forgiveness is granted, then," said the marquise. Fouquet was about to throw himself upon his knees. "No, no," she said, "sit here by my side. Ah, that is an evil thought which has just crossed your mind." "How do you detect it, madame?" "By the smile that has just marred the expression of your countenance. Be candid, and tell me what your thought was. No secrets between friends." "Tell me then, madame, why you have been so harsh these 3 or 4 months past." "Harsh?" "Yes. Did you not forbid me to visit you?" "Alas," said Madame de Belliere, sighing, "because your visit to me was the cause of your being visited with a great misfortune, because my house is watched, because the same eyes that have seen you already might see you again, because I think it less dangerous for you that I should come here than that you should come to my house, and lastly, because I know you to be already unhappy enough not to wish to increase your unhappiness further." Fouquet started, for these words recalled all the anxieties connected with his office of superintendent. He who, for the last few minutes, had indulged in all the wild aspirations of the lover. "I unhappy?" he said, endeavoring to smile. "Indeed, marquise, you will almost make me believe I am so, judging from your own sadness. Are your beautiful eyes raised upon me merely in pity? I was looking for another expression from them." "It is not I who am sad, monsieur. Look in the mirror, there, it is yourself." "It is true I am somewhat pale, marquise, but it is from overwork. The king yesterday required a supply of money from me. Yes, 4 millions. I am aware of it. You know it? Exclaimed Fouquet, in a tone of surprise. How can you have learned it? It was after the departure of the queen, and in the presence of one person only, that the king— You perceive that I do know it. Is that not sufficient? Well, go on, monsieur. The money the king has required you to supply— You understand, Marquis, that I have been obliged to procure it, then to get it counted, afterwards registered, altogether a long affair. Since Monsieur de Mazarin's death, financial affairs occasion some little fatigue and embarrassment. My administration is somewhat overtaxed, and this is the reason why I have not slept during the past night. So you have the amount? Inquired the Marquis, with some anxiety. It would indeed be strange, Marquis, replied Fouquet cheerfully, if a superintendent of finances were not to have a paltry 4 millions in his coffers. Yes, yes, I believe you either have or will have them. What do you mean by saying I shall have them? It is not very long since you were required to furnish 2 millions. On the contrary, it seems almost an age. But do not let us talk of money matters any longer. On the contrary, we will continue to speak of them, for that is my only reason for coming to see you. I am at a loss to compass your meaning, said the superintendent, whose eyes began to express an anxious curiosity. Tell me, monsieur, is the office of superintendent a permanent position? You surprise me, Marchioness, for you speak as if you had some motive or interest in putting the question. My reason is simple enough. I am desirous of placing some money in your hands, and naturally I wish to know if you are certain of your post. Really, Marquis, I am at a loss what to reply. I cannot conceive your meaning. Seriously, then, dear Monsieur Fouquet, I have certain funds which somewhat embarrass me. I am tired of investing my money in lands, and am anxious to entrust it to some friend who will turn it to account. Surely it does not press, said Monsieur Fouquet. On the contrary, it is very pressing. Very well, we will talk of that by and by. By and by will not do, for my money is there, returned the Marquise, pointing out the coffer to the superintendent, and showing him, as she opened it, the bundles of notes and heaps of gold. Fouquet, who had risen from his seat at the same moment as Madame de Belliere, remained for a moment plunged in thought. Then suddenly starting back, he turned pale, and sank down in his chair, concealing his face in his hands. Madame, madame, he murmured, what opinion can you have of me when you make me such an offer? Of you? Returned the Marquise. Tell me, rather, what you yourself think of the step I have taken. You bring me this money for myself, and you bring it because you know me to be embarrassed. Nay, do not deny it, for I am sure of it. Can I not read your heart? If you know my heart, then, can you not see that it is my heart I offer you? I have guessed rightly, then, exclaimed Fouquet. In truth, madame, I have never yet given you the right to insult me in this manner. Insult you? She said, turning pale. What singular delicacy of feeling! You tell me you love me. In the name of that affection you wish me to sacrifice my reputation and my honor. Yet, when I offer you money, which is my own, you refuse me. Madame, you are at liberty to preserve what you term your reputation and your honor. Permit me to preserve mine. Leave me to my ruin. Leave me to sink beneath the weight of the hatreds which surround me. beneath the faults I have committed, beneath the load even of my remorse, but, for heaven's sake, madame, do not overwhelm me with this last infliction. A short time since, Monsieur Fouquet, you were wanting in judgment, now you are wanting in feeling. Fouquet pressed his clenched hand upon his breast, heaving with emotion, saying, "Overwhelm me, madame, for I have nothing to reply." "I offered you my friendship, Monsieur Fouquet." "Yes, madame, and you limited yourself to that." "And what I am now doing is the act of a friend." "No doubt it is." "And you reject this mark of my friendship?" "I do reject it." "Monsieur Fouquet, look at me," said the marquise, with glistening eyes. "I now offer you my love." "Oh, madame!" exclaimed Fouquet, "I have loved you for a long while past. Women, like men, have a false delicacy at times. For a long time past I have loved you, but would not confess it. Well, then, you have implored this love on your knees, and I have refused you. I was blind, as you were a little while since, but as it was my love that you sought, it is my love I now offer you. Oh, madame, you overwhelm me beneath a load of happiness. Will you be happy, then, if I am yours entirely? It will be the supremest happiness for me. Take me, then. If, however, for your sake I sacrifice a prejudice, do you, for mine, sacrifice a scruple. Do not tempt me. Do not refuse me. Think seriously of what you are proposing. Fouquet, but one word, let it be no, and I open this door," and she pointed to the door which led into the streets, "and you will never see me again. Let that word be yes, and I am yours entirely." "Elise, Elise!" "But the coffer?" "Contains my dowry." "It is your ruin!" exclaimed Fouquet, turning over the gold and papers. "There must be 1,000,000 here." "Yes, my jewels, for which I care no longer if you do not love me, and for which, equally, I care no longer if you love me as I love you." "This is too much!" exclaimed Fouquet. I yield, even were it only to consecrate so much devotion. I accept the dowry." "And take the woman with it," said the marquise, throwing herself into his arms. End of chapter 28. The Dowry. Recording by Filippo Joachim.